Hello, and welcome to Perspectives on Neurodiversity, a podcast dedicated to challenging the myths and assumptions about neurodiverse life. I am your host, Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Joining us for this episode is Martha Engber. She is the author of Winter Light, an independent publisher's gold medal winner in young adult fiction. Her other books include the novels The Falcon, The Wolf and the Hummingbird, and The Wind Thief, and the resource for writers growing great characters from the ground up. Martha is a speaker and workshop facilitator. She's had dozens of short stories and poems published in literary magazines and a play produced in Hollywood. She lives in California with her husband. She likes to bike and surf. We invite you to connect to Martha at marthaengber.com. That's marthaengber.com. Martha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Christopher. Really appreciate being here.
We are discussing a very personal book. It is not a work of fiction. It is a memoir called Bliss Road. Can we explain to the audience what Bliss Road is as a memoir?
A memoir, by definition, at least my definition, is one that tells the personal journey of someone. And they come to some form of enlightenment. And so what drew me to write Bliss Road is because I felt for a long time that there were certain dysfunctions in my otherwise happy family. And I was, being a journalist and a naturally curious person, I felt the need to discover what was causing me a certain amount of unhappiness in my life. And through a variety of means, discovered what the extent to which I had been affected by my dad, who was undiagnosed autistic. And it is something that my sisters and I had discerned through a variety of symptoms shown over his lifetime, and it became prevalent when my mother became very ill with cancer. And so his distress at her demise, if you will, is something that brought out the symptoms and even more high relief. And it is something that made sense because my sister had two kids diagnosed on the spectrum. And as you know, to some degree, autism and other neurodiversities have a hereditary thread. And so I didn't realize then that I was affected because I was a neurotypical person who had a neurodivergent parent. And the contrast between the two caused a communication problem between us that caused, essentially, I didn't grow emotionally attached to my dad, which for your listeners might be nodding their heads, because that is a part of autism in which the communication between two people is disrupted. So I discovered that it was that miscommunication and that lack of emotional attachment to my dad that really affected me as a person and as a parent. And so the book essentially explores that degree of miscommunication, but it also has a very hopeful note, because coming out of something like that, where you discover that your loving parent had this disability that they didn't want and that affected you, allows you to essentially heal. And so it is, again, a very hopeful message to others that they can come closer together, understanding that neurodiverse families, and I am in a neurodiverse family, you have to care for everybody in the family. And that means clearly identifying this person. One kid might be neurotypical, the other might be neuroatypical, and that everybody is in the same boat and working together and has to be cared for. And so that is one of the reasons I love the book. It's just wonderful now to see that we are talking more about neurodiverse families and increasing the support for and understanding of them.
The structure of the book is unique. You use poetry, you use journalistic technique, there's hints of academic scholarship, and then there are the elements of traditional memoir, the anecdotes and the observations from your relationships. What led you to this very unique structure that uses poetry, and then you go into the anecdotes and then go into the scholarship, and then you repeat this cycle throughout the book? What led to that structure?
I think it was most difficult and necessary to come up with a unique format because of the invisibility initially of autism. And most likely this would be true for other forms of neurodivergence. And for your readers, or for your listeners, they probably know that neurodivergence can be a mental illness, such as anxiety. It can be a physical brain disorder, such as stroke. It can be a behavioral problem, like ADHD. And then it can be a neurodiversity, such as autism. If my parents had been an alcoholic, there are physical and visual symptoms that other people can see. Kids can see it, the spouses can see it, the neighbors can see it. There is something that people can see. But when my dad was growing up, nobody had a name for autism, and it was a invisible situation he lived with, and that was having an effect on us, but there were no words for it. There were no phrases for it. How do you find something that's invisible? And so that was the biggest challenge of writing this book. How do you make people appreciate that you were trying to hunt for something that was invisible? You couldn't see it. You couldn't prove it. You couldn't, right? How do you, and so that's one of the reasons that the poetry was a natural extension of this general frustration at these various stages of my life. I couldn't explain what the problem was. I do have an excerpt, and I'm not sure if you have time, that does explain what effect a neuroatypical parent might have on a neurotypical kid. That explains something that might happen as soon as the baby is born, right? It's this general miscommunication that could occur, but that hopefully we will, as a society, provide parents with better parenting and coaching strategies to help their kids, whether they're neurodiverse or neurotypical.
Before we go into that excerpt, for the audience, your mother and father had very different personalities.
Yes.
And how they interacted with people, how they interacted with family members. How do you examine that relationship? Because obviously the spousal relationship exists, and then the parent to child relationship. You open with the anecdotes of your mother and father.
My parents, and I think that your listeners again will be able to find these pieces in their own family, is that we all know that neurodivergent people are wonderful and as wonderful as neurotypical people. But there's often a lot of misunderstanding that takes place. So my dad is, and again, he is undiagnosed autistic, or was, now deceased, was in many respects a wonderful guy. He grew up in a blue-collar family in Alton, Illinois, hardworking, dedicated to family, very curious man, very loved to learn, loved to travel, and loved us as kids. And my mother had the kind of nature in which she loved caring for people. And so when she met him, she not only saw his wonderful attributes, but also naturally fell into a caregiving role. And that included covering for him when his responses in public were inappropriate. And he would now be considered high functioning. That term, as you know, is falling a little out of favor for what is called low maintenance ASD, which means that you need perhaps less help than other people in the spectrum. And so he fell into that category. It was the combination, and that's a very typical combination. You have one person who is more challenged and the other person who acts as protector. And so that combination took place. And fortunately, my mom was a very loving, caring, socially adept person who could be that shield for my dad, which was wonderful for us in the sense that, we got that love and so forth. But because she was acting as his protector, it meant she wasn't our protector. She would not stand up for us sometimes when we most needed it. And I think, again, if we take anything from this experience, and this is the first memoir written by a neurotypical child of a neurodiverse parent, then I am fully advocate. I think all parents should have coaching, but it would be especially helpful in neurodiverse families, because then you can say to the neurotypical parent, perhaps, hey, you need to be able to step in and protect your kids when the neurodiverse parent is perhaps off base, which would be great, because, and that is something that wasn't present for us. So the upshot is I didn't end up bonding with either parent because, but fortunately I did with my sisters. And so they proved to be a real support for me. And I credit that kind of combination of people to loving parents, even if I didn't emotionally bond with them, I had my sisters. And so all together, we were able to make it all work. But it would have been a lot easier had we had guidance, and had we had phrases, if my parents had coaching when we were just little kids. That is the sense that regarding my parents and how they played into it.
You have an excerpt about the relationship between the parent and the child.
Yes. And this is when I went to do research for the book. And as you say, you're talking about the unique structure of it. And I went through a timeline of history that was not only history of what was happening in the culture, but also history with my family. So people could see that a lot of this was unknown as my dad grew up. And that's why we didn't discover it till later. And when I was doing research, I was really frankly appalled that there was no information on the psychological effects of a neurodiverse parent on a neurotypical kid. There were like a handful of articles that were all anecdotal. So I wrote a small section here that in the book that gives the feeling of what might have happened to my self-esteem, not out of anybody's fault, but when I was just a little baby, because I think of self-esteem from the one study I found is more or less determined by the age of 5. And so a lot can happen in those years. And if the communication between a parent-child is not there, then that can get lost. So here's the excerpt. Envision I'm a baby of between 6 months and a year old. I'm sitting on a floor in a white-walled room. A man stands before me. Beside me is a thing people sit on. I recognize the man. He's somehow connected to the woman who feeds and dresses me. I don't have a name for him or her or the chair because I'm so young. But I know the man and woman are different from the chair. They're like me. They move and make noise. What they do determines how I feel. Happy, scared, sad, or any variety of other emotions for which I have no name. I rely on people's eyes for clues about whether they'll be mean or nice to me. That's why I'm waiting for the man to look at me. I want an idea of what he'll do. The fact he hasn't looked at me yet makes me anxious because it's unusual. I've noticed when the woman walks in, she looks at me immediately. Then she smiles and picks me up. Sometimes she jiggles me around while making faces and I feel warm inside and laugh. After studying the room, the man lowers his eyes toward me. They reach my head and without stopping, move down my face and body, then slide sideways to the chair. Something happened. I don't know what. His eyes pass mine with no pause or smile or interest. He looks at the chair the same way. If he's important to me somehow, he must know what's what. If he treats me like a chair, I must be like a chair. Thing, no worse, no better.
The perception then of the child from your perspective is that your father was, whether he was internally or not, he was demonstrating what felt like detachment.
Correct. That is correct. And through, as we know, through no fault of his at all. And yet it can be profound, so that, I was in my 50s when I finally realized I had been, and that was the impetus for the enlightenment that comes in the book, is that when my mom died, death can often act as a crucible. And in this case, I realized that she never knew me and I never knew her. One of the reasons is that I had been masking. I had been subverting my personality since I was, since whenever. And I didn't even know who I was because my self-esteem was non-existent. I just didn't have one. It wasn't, it's like I couldn't take a compliment because I knew they were complimenting a public persona I had developed to protect myself. And that wasn't really me. So the compliment didn't belong to me. And so it was a foundational rift that occurred that was earth-shaking. And it's again, something hard to convey. When people have a more dramatic story, perhaps they almost died during a war or something of that nature, there is an understandable emotion attached with it, but it's really hard to convey to people what it's like to realize that you have no self-esteem, not even a low self-esteem, have no self-esteem. And it's a very weird thing. It's very strange. But from there, I was able to learn how to become authentic. And I'd never known what that term meant before. But learning to become authentic was really terrifying because you have to discover who you are, and you have to be ready for the fact that when people know who you really are, they might criticize you. Right? I'd spent all those years, decades, trying to be a perfect person that would draw no attention. And that was then to be able to expose yourself and become vulnerable was just terrifying. So
why would you try to be invisible?
In our dynamics, I guess the idea is this. If I at some point picked up on the fact that I thought, rightly or wrongly, my dad just more or less thought it was something, a thing, not a real person, not very interesting, then as a kid, I would say, oh, wow, I'm not really anything. And I know that other people are not going to like that, right? That is not an attractive quality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay in the middle of this, and I'm going to create this bubble around me. And the bubble is going to be interesting. The bubble is going to laugh, and the bubble is going to, this outward mask that is going to dress right, and they say right things, and it's going to be trouble-free, right? If whoever comes to me, if they need help, I'll give them help, and I'm not going to present any troubles for them. And that way, people will like me. And that really works for years and years. And I had no reason to question, and I had no way to say, hey, wait a second, what are you doing? There was no sense of that. It was only after my mom died and I had that startling revelation. It's like, wow, she didn't know who I was at all. She was responding to this perfect daughter because my middle sister had ADHD, which runs very strong in our family. And that was undiagnosed at that time. So she had so many challenges on behavioral, and she's a marvelous person, really funny person. And but she had a lot of challenges during those teen years, and no understanding from my folks because they didn't know what was wrong with her. And so I was the one who just said, well, I'll just shut up. I'll be the good one. And that's what cemented my I am no problem persona, right? You just, and that's not, that's very typical in families, that kids will assume roles. And I've since learned that that's a term that's used as parentification. That means that the parent looks toward the child to be an adult in some respect. And so to some respect, I felt like my mom, because she had challenges with both my dad and my sister, that she looked to me and she was very grateful, and she communicated how grateful she was that I never caused trouble. And so there was a parentification going on. And that was the agreement. You don't cause me any trouble, and that'll be great. But unfortunately, you end up not sharing anything with your parents. So I didn't confide in her, and that causes emotional disconnect. And that's one of the reasons I never really bonded with her, is because I understood she didn't want me to say things to her that might worry her. So I just didn't. And therefore, the price of that is that you don't emotionally connect with the person. And so that's, of course, where my sisters were my saviors, as I say in the beginning of the book, is that I was able to bond with them, and they were able to give me that emotional connection. And I feel fortunate that that was the case.
The revelations in the book begin in 1997. You have a nephew who is diagnosed as autistic.
Yes, and he was 3. And yeah.
How does that set things into motion for you and your family?
Well, 1993, as you know, is when the first, they called it Asperger's at that time, and they no longer call it Asperger's, but rather low, as I say, low maintenance or low needs ASD. He was diagnosed at, I think, the age of 3. And then a couple years later, his brother had pervasive developmental disorder, which was also on the spectrum. And I thought to myself, wow, my sister's really unlucky. And so I, at that time, didn't realize how any of it was connected to me. I didn't question it. I just thought, oh, that person over there is having a lot of trouble. I feel really bad for them. And it wasn't until then my mom died in 2012. And then there was an incident with my dad where I just really saw the depth of his communication disability, and the possible reason for my lack of any self-esteem. Then I realized, wow, it didn't just happen to my sister. It happened to all of us. We were all in it. And as I had said at the beginning of this podcast, that's my whole wish for this book, is that we really get to the next level of our discussion on neurodiversity by talking about how we're all in the same boat. And what's been amazing is that everybody who reads the book either says, wow, I'm neurodivergent, or I know somebody who is. And that tracks with statistics. That's 20% of the entire world's population of billions of people is neurodivergent. That means everybody we know knows somebody within their direct and immediate families who's neurodivergent. And therefore, the next step in our discussion about neurodivergence is that we need more support for these families. We need to, give families the tools, the phrases, the words to use so that parents can explain to their children, hey, I have autism and it means this, or I have dyslexia and it means this. If I do something like this, here's what you can do to bring it to my attention that I have not done something right. It brings it all forward. If my mother, for example, had been given those tools, she would have been able to say to my dad, hey, Ray, that was off base. You need to sit down here and we need to talk about what happened. But there wasn't that. Everything was, he would have rages that would really scare us little kids. And there was no discussion. Hey, what happened? So we never knew if he was going to do it again or when he was going to do it again, which is presents a high level of nervousness, yes, in kids. What's going to set them off next time? it's encouraging to me that we're not talking about something like cancer where we still don't have an answer for it. We have a relatively simple idea of providing more information, more tools, and perhaps we can get more research into what's necessary to help not only parents, but schools. Think about how wonderful that would be if a parent was able to say, hey, I'm neurodivergent, but I think my child is neurotypical. What help can we provide? Maybe the kid can be assessed. We can make sure that that kid's emotional needs are okay. And if not, you can help me discover what I should do to help them. And vice versa. Currently, the discussion is about, I have a kid on the spectrum who is neurodivergent. Remember, dyslexia and dysgraphia, those are all neurodivergences, learning disabilities. So it's on, I have this one kid and this kid has this issue, and let's help this one kid. But the kid is connected to family. That means if the kid has siblings, what about those siblings? How are they interacting with those siblings, right? So that we get a much more even and balanced flow within family. We're able to say, hey, so-and-so needs a little help. But on the other hand, we got to take care of this other kid.
We see dynamics naturally in all families with birth order. As you said, the oldest tends to take on more responsibility. Studies have shown that if there's more than 2 kids, the youngest generally has the most lenient expectations. I see this in my wife's family where there are 3 daughters. I see this in families just of students or people I work with, that the first one was we're going to do everything right. We're going to read all the books, do everything right. And then by the 3rd child, it's like, okay, we're just going to go with the flow. And expectations change. That is something we see even within our daughters, even though they're only 14, 15 months apart. The oldest is in many ways parenting. She is the oldest. She's the big sister. She takes responsibility. She behaves differently. So even though they're both neurodivergent, we even see that dynamic of the oldest taking on a parental role. And sometimes we have to remind her, you are not your sister's parent. Let us do the parenting. You be a kid. So I know some of these things naturally occur in all families. But when your mother was highly focused on both your father and your sister, you said that for you forced you into something of a shell and isolation. What did that do? I guess you have another sister.
My oldest sister also, and I think it's, as you say, is that the first one tends to take on a role of leadership. And so my sister did that. And it was interesting to know that how anyone deals with whatever dysfunction in their takes place in their family. And every single family has a dysfunction, no matter how loving and how the parents have attempted to do everything right. Every single family has a dysfunction. In this case, the first one, Deanna at least had full attention from my mom for a time. And I think that was probably a very healthy thing for her emotionally. And then when 2 little kids came along, my middle sister came along, she was more distracted. And when the 3rd came along, there just wasn't that time or that emotional energy to expend on that 3rd one. And I think that that's how it can get lost sometimes. But it also is interesting that with every dysfunction, how a person deals with it really depends on their own brain. And so that's why each person has a different response. And for my oldest sister, what she said recently was really interesting. She said, when I was reading your book, it's like, oh, wow, that did happen. And I'd forgotten. So she thinks that her essentially coping mechanism was selective memory. That she would just, if something was inconvenient memory, she would just forget it and leave it, right? And that is a very effective method. For my middle sister, her nature and her brain just wouldn't allow her with ADHD. She just had to speak up anyway. That, of course, is one of the difficulties, is that kids often get in trouble for speaking their mind without thinking first. And she got in trouble for that all the time. But the good thing is, and the thing that I always valued in her, is that she couldn't let her distress hide. And so she just blurted it. So it was very tumultuous. But she got it out of her system. And she was able to eventually confront my dad on one occasion. And therefore, that was how she healed herself. And in my case, it was, again, it's, I think, a very understandable method of coping, which is I'm just going to hide everything. Just going to not talk about it. I'm just going to become invisible. And invisibility, apparently, as I was doing research, is a real thing. And it tends to be the case with kids who need to make themselves feel small and invisible to avoid what they perceive as threats. And this can happen, for example, when a parent has a substance abuse problem. It can happen when they have a mental illness that's very scary and could be triggered by something a kid says. In this case, it was that was the case. So my dad would get into rages, and it would scare us. And he didn't do it that often, but it was scary enough that that it would have a profound effect on us. It's for kids, it's not knowing. That's the worst. And if they don't understand what's happening to a parent, why a parent is acting differently, then they have a need to escape somehow or find some way to protect themselves. And so therefore it's behooves parents to discover ways to actually talk about their kid, with their kids about something scary, talk openly about incidents that happen in the family. And coming from the generation I did, my parents were both born in 1930s, and the whole cultural attitude was, don't say anything. Just, push it down. Let's pretend it didn't happen. And that is very, very unhealthy. And that's one of the things I hope my book achieves, is that people are encouraged to talk about it. That when you talk about it, you take the fear away and you allow more healthy emotions to emerge. I really longed, even as a kid, to be able to tell my parents things that are very scary to children. Maybe they're frightened about what they might be capable of, or they had a really scary incident when it's a stranger, or they're scared about something they overheard, right? If you have no one to tell that to, that creates anxiety in the kid. And then they grow into an adult and they're very anxious as adults. And people are like, well, why are you anxious? And the response typically in the adult is, I don't know why, I am. In the book, I say it's really good to do what you can to drill down to find the source of those anxieties. Because once you find it, then your chance of actually of getting rid of it are much higher. It's not a guarantee, but it's much higher. And to rid myself of anxieties has been life-changing. I've slept better. I've been more open with people. I have deeper relationships with people. I have been able to be more forthright with my kid about what happened, because of course they suffered because I was emotionally distant myself. That's why I encourage people to, even though it's a scary pilgrimage, to actually discover the source of their angst and do so through help. Like I got therapy, and I think everybody should be able to get therapy and feel it's okay to do that. I am a personal trainer besides a writer, and so that's how I've gotten to think of things that we humans need in life. If you need physical help, you go to a personal trainer. If you need help with your thinking, you go to a therapist. If you need help reading, you go to a reading specialist. And we should have it become that normal. Oh, I'm going to my trainer now. I'm going to my therapist now. I'm going to my reading specialist now. And nobody blinks an eye. And I think that that's the exciting part about the discussion about neurodiversity. That's where we're going. People can openly say, I'm in a neurodiverse family, or, I have a neurodiverse kid, and nobody bats an eye. I think that's a marvelous place to be going.
In the generational differences and the cultural differences, your father doesn't understand your sister's ADHD. He looks at it as a failure. How did that affect you as a sister and your mother? Because he is disapproving of her impulsivity, of her nature.
Yeah, my dad, if we were to look at it, is that he was the oldest of his 5 siblings, but he was a kind of a short kid. And when you're in a kind of a rough and tumble neighborhood environment, he was beaten up a lot, and he even had his arm broken in a fight. He, therefore, I think for him, any sign of disrespect would trigger him. And he would see that as a sign of disrespect rather than, oh, this problem is with the kid. So he would personalize it rather than being able to see. And that's some result, as you know, of a common result of ASD is that it's very difficult, perhaps, to see another person's perspective. So, for example, when my sister Sue would perhaps say something back to him, give him a retort, he would see that as a challenge to that she didn't respect him, rather than there's something wrong that she can't control herself. There's something wrong that she can't get her homework in on time. There's something wrong that she seems to be disorganized all the time. As a parent, he was not able to help in that respect. All he saw was that, she was wacky and obviously doing this to disrespect him. And so that's why the relationship between the two of them was very charged for a long time. And it was hard to see. It was hard to see my sister suffering. It was another reason that I would just turn invisible, because if Sue is an agitator, right, it could possibly set him off, then I am going to be running away because I don't want to be around when that happens, because I don't know what's going to happen. At the same time, I would, be there to counsel her and to try to, and her self-esteem suffered terribly and still suffers to some degree because of that. That's, I guess, the outcome. So it was tough to see.
As you mentioned in the text, there are different forms of ADHD. Our daughters both have the diagnosis. The oldest is hyper-focused. She is a swimmer. She is in band, as you described yourself, always in motion. And our youngest is the impulsive, instinctive, kind of chaotic form of ADHD. And I think there's a lot of assumptions about neurodiversity that, if we're going to say hyperactive, this is what we mean. If we're going to say autistic, this is what we mean, or dyslexic or dyscalculia. But each of these can be expressed in so many different ways. You are extremely active, and it is possible that you have ADHD just in that other form.
Yes, and I would be the first to admit that. ADHD, of 8 kids born to my sisters and myself, 6 were diagnosed with ADHD, right? And that's heavy. So my daughter at one time, after she was diagnosed with ADHD, she said, well, you very well could be. And then I'm like, well, I could be. And it's possible that she had liked me in the respect that at some point she just got really organized. And I did the same thing as a kid. I got really organized and always have been. And that could very well be a form of coping, because it didn't cause me any difficulty. I have not gone to get diagnosed, but I am open to the idea that I might be. And it doesn't bother me. I don't think of it as a failure anymore. What I'm coming to is that we live within a much broader span of neurodiversity than we imagine, and we should have room for all of that and processes to help people succeed. I think about when, before dyslexia was known, that those kids were considered stupid or just not trying hard enough. And then, of course, scientists came in, they began to study such kids. And oh, maybe there is something wrong. And then they began to come up with actual data to show and to prove what was possibly occurring in these kids' heads. And so then it became, oh, it's a thing. It's a real thing. And then from there, they have developed processes. But that educators got involved and educational experts, and they said, well, if we develop these different strategies, that will help them. And so now when a kid is diagnosed with something like dyslexia, that kid is automatically, it's a smooth transition. They just move right into those processes and to those specialists. And that's what would be wonderful if our school systems would help with that, with neurodiversity, that it would be that smooth transition instead of, oh, we got another one of those kids that needs a lot of help, right? It wouldn't be that. It would be, okay, a teacher has 25 kids in her classroom and 20 of them at least would be shot into different avenues of help because they're all different. This one goes to a reading specialist. This one goes to a behavior specialist. This one goes to whatever. And we have those processes established so the kids are not traumatized. More importantly, the parents knowing and having phrases and words and ways of explaining can point out to kids, oh, this is how you are. And this is okay for you. And you're okay. And help those kids determine self-esteem rather than, you're a troublemaker. And I think that would be marvelous. That kids don't develop this sense of there's something wrong with me. Instead, oh, there's something different about me. But then everybody is like, all the kids are like, yeah, I'm different in this way, and I'm different in this way, and I'm different in this way. So that being different is normal, which is a wonderful idea.
You talk about your career path in the book. Your parents expected for lack of a better phrase, a steady, reliable career path, practical. You did like I did, and you studied journalism. I think that disappointed my parents greatly since I was a computer programmer in high school and they thought computer science had a great future. Why are you studying English and journalism? How did you make that choice when your sisters somewhat followed the advice of your parents? They went practical. Your father expected practical. How did you deal with that choice? And how did your father react to you doing something that wasn't necessarily as perceived as practical?
Well, writing for me became one of two main avenues for expression because I had no way of venting, so to speak. But when my sister gave me a journal when I was in my freshman year of high school and I began writing in it, I found an avenue where I could talk to myself, where I could let it out. Or if I was really angry, I could just scribble and spew, and it was absolute godsend. And the other way was through dance, which allowed me another form of expression and movement. And movement also has that extra bonus of releasing endorphins into your system so that it makes you feel better. And so that is every single day I do some form of movement because that's my mental health break. All right. Help that it maintains a really steady place. So the fact that I wanted to do, I had a very creative, mind, and like my mom, believe it or not, my dad actually liked the idea of journalism because there's a certain cachet to that. It is considered a practical, if not very high paying profession. For example, I couldn't have said, I'm going to go into creative writing. They wouldn't have gone for that. But journalism, at least you could get internships, you could get jobs in a regular way. So I did that and have been extremely happy that I took that route because it taught me discipline and tenacity in actually hunting down information, research, to get to the bottom of something, a cause, something that I didn't know. And that there hasn't been a day I haven't used my journalism. Every day I learn something new. I discover something I haven't before. And the process of journalism obviously set me up to be able to write books and organize them and so forth, which has great. But I just, it instilled in me the need and the right to dig deeply. And I think that that's what scares people most. They don't want to dig deeply. My mom used to say that. She's like, oh, she used to say every once in a while, oh, if I started crying, I would just probably continue crying. So that was her. She just didn't want to look. And I think most people don't want to look. But oddly enough, if you do look, while painful, when you come out the other side, the relief you feel is so tremendous that you'll say, I am so glad I did that, rather than keeping it all bottled up. Because keeping it all bottled up just allows the dysfunction to keep bubbling up. So that your whole life, you're getting stuck with these moments that make you so unhappy that you might snipe at your kids, or you might be rejected by somebody you want to be a friend with, or you're upset about your treatment in some situation. And those are all little ways in which this deep unhappiness has never been treated, where if you treat it, then those smaller things go away. You don't have those. I used to be really, sometimes it would irritate me, right? That people would do something and I'd be like, oh, that's so inconvenient. Why do they do that? And now I have the opposite view. I'm like, wow, they must be really having a bad day. So it's no longer I'm the victim. It's that other people need help. And what a tremendous change in perception that allows for a much happier life. Not totally happy. Nobody can claim total. Wow. If I had to quantify it, I'd have to say my life is 80% better because I did this work. And I assume that if we're all happier, we would be just better to one another. Our world would literally be better. We'd be less likely to cause fights. We would be less likely to see ourselves as victims and unable to solve our problems. We'd be more likely to extend help. And that would be a marvelous thing.
The expectation I had based on your father's relationship with you and your sisters as children was that it would improve as you got older, that he would start to recognize some of those connections and foster them. And instead, we encounter a story, I believe you're in college or on break, and you go to dinner with your father.
Yeah, that was an interesting situation in which I was on break. My dad asked me to go to dinner, and I had assumed he and my mom wanted to take me out, which they often would when I would come in to visit. And on this occasion, my mom said, oh, no, he's just taking you. And that was very unusual because I never did anything. That was the thing, is that when people talk about their relationships with their dad and how much their dad meant to them and what lessons they learned from them, I could never identify because I didn't have any of that. My dad was the person who earned money, and he was there, and he was pleasant, but there was no relationship. And so I thought that was really odd. But I'm like, well, okay, I'll go. And we had a really nice time. My dad, like other people, ASD people, had a tendency to monologue. So he would often just talk about the things he'd read in the paper and so forth. And I would listen, because that's what you do, because you're, if I would try to respond or something, you would often either talk over me or it wouldn't register for him. So, I got very comfortable just listening. That's another form of why journalism worked out for me. After that, I thought, well, that was fun. It was like the first time. And my mother had told me about an occasion where when she was in college, her dad, who was a traveling salesman, and she didn't see much of him, asked her to go to dinner. And it was a very important night for my mother because it was the first time she actually got to know her dad as an adult. And so I thought, well, maybe this is that occasion. And so I had found an opportunity, said, hey, Dad, maybe that was really fun. Maybe we could do that again. And he looked at me and said, why would we? And it was so shocking for me and so hurtful because there was something in his eyes that was truly, well, why would we do that again? Right? It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was It was as if there was no reason to, that I was not. And I think that was just because he had in his head some particular reason for taking me to dinner, either because that's what you do with guests, you treat them, or it was because maybe my mom had suggested, hey, you should take her to dinner and get to know her a little better, like my dad did for me, at least once. So he did it once, and then he's like, well, okay, obligation has been fulfilled. But he obviously didn't understand that was, and we never, ever, ever went to do anything together again.
And do you think that was how his relationships were with other adults?
Oh yeah, because my mom was his one friend, and he didn't have any other. He didn't have any other male friends, and I think partly it's because, as you know as well, with autism, that often autistic folks are so comfortable by themselves, right? That it's hard to actually go socialize and stuff because that is much more chaotic. Whereas when you're by yourself, you understand yourself and you're happy by yourself. And my dad was often very happy by himself. He would take care of his stocks, check those every day. He would read the paper. He would do home maintenance projects. And he didn't see a need for friends, nor did he necessarily understand how to be friends. He had people he played tennis with and stuff. But again, it was just, these are the people who can provide me with a certain activity I like to do. It wasn't, oh, I'm concerned for this person and I should call them, or, I enjoy their company. It wasn't like that. I think he was, with that dinner, is that he was in his head, he had a certain duty he felt needed to be done. And by taking me once, he had done that duty. And therefore there was so he was done. It was off his to-do list. Right? There wasn't the idea of pursuing a relationship with me didn't, strike him as necessary. And so that's, of course, something that experts who are familiar with autism and will be able to point out to folks and say, oh, here's what you could say, or here's why it's necessary to ask these follow-up questions of people, and here's how you show you care about other people.
I hope that some of this is generational. I think of my own relationship with my daughters, the way I'm approaching it. I know that I trade off with them which one I take to dinner or out to treats, which one I take to an activity. At the same time, I know I do not have any close friends, not someone I would go to lunch with, dinner with, someone I would hang out with. There's nothing like that in my life, or to my knowledge, to my wife's life. We sit at home and we read, but I'm very concerned about my daughters. I want them to have friends. So that's why they're in Girl Scouts and band or swimming and basketball, is we want them to develop those friendships. And yet what I'm noticing is, even though we're putting them in the social situations, the oldest will perform with the band and then walk off the stage. She doesn't congratulate her bandmates. She doesn't say, good job, everyone. This was a nice evening. She finishes her part on drums or keyboard or whatever she's playing and walks off the stage. So even though I know that my life would have been better with friendships and close connections, both personally and professionally, I'm doing all I can, but I don't think that I'm able to even help my daughters do what I wasn't able to do. But I am trying to form those connections with them, even if I don't have those connections with other people. But it isn't easy when you are a neurodiverse family with, 3 of us definitely neurodiverse. Helping my daughters form social connections when neither my wife nor I have those social connections is a real challenge.
First of all, one of the things that's most interesting is that I first learned about you probably about 10 years ago. You had the WordPress blog, the Autistic Me, and I had a WordPress blog as well. And occasionally that WordPress would say, hey, do you want to connect with these other bloggers? And I just happened to connect with you, and I would read your posts. And I thought one of the best things was how open you were with your experience. And that is the kind of openness that can lead to improvements in social behavior. For example, my nephew, Brian, as I said in the book, he had a lot of trouble with his public school and ended up going to a private school that deals with kids who have communication disorders. And he blossomed. And one of the reasons he blossomed is because they had developed the words and phrases and tools necessary for him to be able to analyze a situation and then provide an appropriate response that would in turn reap a social gain. He has friends now. And so I think that you are on the right track, and that is what we need to promote with neurodiverse families, is just openness to talk about, hey, we're autistic, or we're not autistic, and these are our needs. And here is what you can actually say to when you finish that band concert is you can say to two people who are nearby, you did a good job and you did a good job. And then you can strive for certain goals, like saying, oh, you've never had a sleepover before. Would you like to do that? Let's talk about how to make that happen. So in other words, just talking with kids about who you are, who they are, and what you both need will open the avenues for actually figuring out how to achieve what people want. And I think that's fabulous. I hope you feel encouraged that you are on the right path just by being open with your daughters. And then hopefully you've also got some tools that you've developed, like the social scripts that my nephew had, that they actually gave him. They said, if somebody, for example, if somebody offers you something, you don't just say no, right? Because that doesn't, you say no, thank you. And in that thank you, you're acknowledging the politeness of somebody else to offer you something. It's not just a statement of fact. Do you want this? No. Right? That ends there. It's acknowledging them. And those are huge. Right? That has served my nephew very well. And he's doing very well now as an engineer. And
I think that your father benefited from your mother being that social script and that social guide.
Correct.
As you look back, have you developed, it certainly sounds like you have, but have you developed a greater empathy and understanding of who he was, and how has that changed, even though your parents are now, they've passed away now, but how has that changed how you look at them and how you understand their role in your life?
Where we look at people perhaps in a negative light, the only way to change that is to understand them at a deeper level. And that's what the book allowed me to do. When I really looked at who they were and their fears and their disadvantages and information as they were growing up, then I was able to discover for myself that they were doing the best they could. And that's all we can do, is do the best that we can. And that was a very freeing thing. It doesn't mean understanding, a deeper understanding doesn't mean that you can take away the hurts that you've suffered. But what it does mean is that you're going to feel an easing off of hurt. And that is extremely useful. And there hasn't been a moment where I haven't loved my parents and I haven't appreciated the fact they did everything they could for us kids. So that has never changed. But what has changed is there could have been no other outcome based on who they were and the information they had at the time. But now that we all have more information, that can make a huge inroad and improvement into so many people's lives. Again, 1 in 20 people in the world. And so I'm much more likely now to look around, and where I see people behaving in a way that isn't perhaps right, I am in my head thinking, oh, there's a person who thinks different. And therefore, I'm going to use some different strategies. Not, oh, they're a troublemaker. I'm like, no, they And these are all people. And I would hope that people would do that with me, is that we would stop seeing each other as, oh, that person is a problem or whatever. But instead, this is my brother, this is my uncle, this is my sister, this is, how would I want other people to work with them? Well, it's with empathy and understanding. I think we're really moving toward a wonderful place by growing this conversation.
I want to thank you for being on this episode of Perspectives on Neurodiversity. If listeners want to learn more, and I will also include the information in the show notes, but if they would like to learn more about your work, where can listeners find you?
The book is available on all major outlets, and they are also welcome to contact me through my website. You had mentioned at the beginning, but I'll do so again. It's MARTHA. N as in Nancy, G as in good, B as in boy, ER.com, MarthaEngber.com. And I really do invite those who read the book to contact me. The feedback I've gotten has been astounding. The amount of that people have been willing to share their own personal stories.
How did you decide on the title Bliss Road?
When I was moving through all this, I was talking with my sisters about the things I had been discovering. And my sister and I happened to go to a winery in Connecticut, and it was atop a hill, and it was at a corner of one country lane and then another country lane. It was called Bliss Road. And it just struck me as I was standing looking at the street sign, and I was looking out beyond the shade, the shadowy trees to this gorgeous expanse. It occurred to me that it's very difficult when you're in the dark and heavily shaded part of your life, and you see that lightness that can occur, that beauty just beyond your reach, how hard it can be to actually get there. But the pursuit is worth it. And I actually, I don't know if you want me to do this as a closing excerpt, but I can read the poem that is connected with Bliss Road. Would that be all right?
Oh, yes.
This is the first poem. And for those readers, don't be worried. There's only one poem per chapter. So if you're not a poetry person, you can certainly bypass it easily. But this is the sentiment. Bliss Road. There is a sign, Bliss Road, naming a narrow lane atop a high New England hill. The letters written white, radiant in the glow of a dusk summer sun. The view beyond the sign to seeming forever, tender green hills rolling easy around the blue cool of a calm lake. To cross the one, to reach the other side, place takes but a few steps across an uneven width of black pavement in heavy, neck-breaking shadow. And that sets up the rest of the book. I am in shadow, and I'm in darkness, and I want to get to the light. And here's how you can do it too. So I hope that that's what readers get from this.
Well, thank you so much. You have been listening to Martha Engber, author of Bliss Road, on Perspectives on Neurodiversity. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, and please leave a review if you found our discussion useful. Martha, thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Christopher. I really enjoyed it.